name of Allah, the most merciful, the most compassionate. I want to thank the community of friends here for sponsoring this event, and especially to Sarah and Paul for inviting me. I have to say that since first going out to protest and becoming politically involved in 2003, I've always seen the Friends community active, and especially the American Friends Service Committee. And I remember we did quite a lot of events here in Atlanta about Rachel Corrie when she died in Rafah, in Gaza in 2003. And in kind of what brings things full circle, those 3 Palestinian students who were shot in the Northeast were also graduates of the Friends School in Ramallah. So I'm here to talk a bit about being a teacher of Palestinian origin, but of course I teach in an Islamic school. So my story will be a little bit different than those who are teaching in public schools, where there are a lot more dynamics, power dynamics that they would have to keep in mind. But first, I just want to start with an anecdote about the Palestinian issue in higher education. I remember when I was beginning my first day of being a teacher's assistant in graduate school, I was called in by my department, the Center for Middle East Studies, to help host a delegation of high-level Palestinian academics who were visiting the United States on a State Department-sponsored tour. And I remember thinking this was a little bit strange that they would ask me to be there. But in any case, I told my supervisor I'm going to have to miss the first day of work. So I greeted this delegation, who were presidents, vice presidents, and provosts of the major universities in the West Bank and Jerusalem. And along with a professor of early Islam and a professor of Akkadian language, we hosted this delegation. And the mission of this delegation was to see if they could sign memoranda of understanding with our university for things like exchange programs and credit equivalencies and possibly visiting professorships. And they're asking us all of these questions, and of course we have no answers. It's myself and 2 professors completely wrapped up in the academic world. And I come to learn that they had reached out to the president of the University of Chicago at the time and asked for a meeting with him and their counterparts at the university, to which he had his secretary at the Center for Middle East Studies reach out to them and host them, and then take them on a tour of the Oriental Museum. And I thought it's amazing that this was the response. Because in the Oslo years of the 90s, the Palestinians were promised, build your schools, build your institutions, and we'll put you on the path to recognition. So here they were, knocking on the door of opportunity, and all we could show them was a bit of where they already came from, and then send them to the Oriental Museum as if to say, that's where you belong. And you find that this is generally the reception of Palestinian academics. And of course we have exceptions, the notable one being the late Professor Edward Said. And he's left quite a mark in the field of Middle Eastern studies. But it's important to note that he was somewhat of an anomaly in that he came to the field of academia with a background in comparative literature. And that was his focus until 1967, when he actually stopped introducing himself as Egyptian and started saying, I'm Palestinian. So in that sense, he kind of came like a Trojan horse, and he left quite a legacy of students behind him, namely Rashid Khadi and then Joseph Mas'ad. But if you notice, they're all at Columbia University. So it's sort of become like a silo for Palestinian academics. Meanwhile, you look at what we've seen recently with the congressional hearing of the presidents of University of Pennsylvania and MIT and Harvard, and you get a realer picture of how difficult it is for universities to just break the barrier in trying to bring some balance to the narrative. And it's very interesting because we're starting to see a real clash, but at a higher level, which is a good sign of progress. In that, if a lot of the struggle was between students and professors, now it's becoming between professors and the government. So we're getting closer. We're getting closer. And to speak a bit about teaching about Palestine in an Islamic school, I teach at Dar al-Noor School, which is the oldest Islamic school in Atlanta. It was founded in 1990. And for a while it was the only show in town, but quite a few more Islamic schools have opened since then. And of course we have constantly changing demographics. So we teach pre-K through 12th grade. Most of my students are from West African, South Asian, and African American backgrounds. Nonetheless, after October 7th, there was a palpable difference, a palpable change in the air that really had everybody charged. Now, I teach Arabic, Islamic studies, and world history. So the first two subjects rely on texts that were written long before 1948. But when it came to world history, I was nonetheless following the curriculum that we had laid out, which was the Georgia edition of the World History Patterns of Interactions by Rand Macmillan. And yet there was this tension you could feel with students. You wouldn't really hear, full-on diatribes about what's going on, but you would hear, even in the humor and the banter that students are using, references to what's going on in Gaza. So the principal of the school took the very noble and courageous decision to say, Kareem, why don't you give a presentation about the historical context? And when I was able to do that, and I did this about 2 weeks after October 7th, you could feel a difference amongst the student body. Because what they were gathering from social media clips could now be contextualized historically. And it became quite interesting, because as a teacher, one of my major pet peeves is the students' use of social media. A lot of it on TikTok, on Instagram. These particular platforms have been a place where they pick up a lot of influences that we don't want at the school. At the same time, this has been their connection to the issue going on with Palestine. So they see a lot of what's going on, and that's about all they see. Because they say, while some of our parents watch mainstream news at home, we don't really watch that. And when they do catch glimpses of what's coming on CNN and Fox News and so on, it's usually when they've been put in these social media clips. And their observation is to say, while they don't know much about the issue, there's something wrong with the gap between what the mainstream is saying and what we ourselves are seeing. So for them to see these things, in many ways, it makes them feel frustrated, because they are so inundated by footage of what's going on the ground. as are many people who have access to social media and see what's going on in Gaza. And meanwhile, they have their friends in public school and in other non-Islamic schools who see these things, but have very much developed a sort of apathetic approach to it. And I can only think the reason why is because they have schools that do not encourage that sort of pursuit, looking beyond what's already been taught. Now, if you look at these history books, as Professor Julian was mentioning, forgive me, you'll see that they give you just enough of a background that if you were to treat it like any other chapter, it wouldn't really faze you. At the same time, they give you some leads that I think are quite interesting. First of all, because we go through this world history book from the beginning, it will be called Palestine when discussing the Canaanites, the Phoenicians, the Hebrews, and it will stay that way well into the subject of World War I, World War II, up until 1948. Now, of course, they'll discuss in a very surface way what happened in 1948, which, by the way, we should disabuse ourselves of the notion that this is the beginning port, when in reality, it was 1947, which was the Civil War phase, which is when the Nakba began. The 1948, in May of 1948, was only when the Arab armies joined. And that is long after notable and infamous massacres such as Deir Yassin, which caused the Palestinians to have to flee. So you'll have in these history books places where they have these little excerpts taken from literature. One of them, which really surprised me, was one by a famous Palestinian author who, similarly to your story, left Haifa in 1948. His name is Fawaz Turki. And he wrote a very heavy book called The Disinherited. And I encourage you all to read it. And if a student were to really be interested in this, just picking up that name would be something that is a great lead. It would take him places that maybe the teacher wouldn't. But what that needs is a lot of help from beyond or in between the lines. So we need parents to be actively involved. We need those who interact with the teachers, who interact, of course, with their students, to bring this subject up and ask, how is it being addressed? Because if you notice, and I'm sure some of you who work in some of the major schools and institutions, you'll see that you have sometimes an email from the president, and it usually starts out in a quite a moderate tone, trying to be as balanced as possible. And I'm talking about the days right after October 7th. Then usually there comes the double tap. The second email that comes in very vociferously pro-Israel language. And that is because there are people who approach these presidents and say, I want you to make more of an issue and more of a deal of what happened, particularly from this angle. Whereas we find a lot of parents at the school, not at my school particularly, because they assume that the teachers are all on the same page, which they are. But in many public schools, I can say this much. They don't speak out. And I can say, particularly for the Muslim student body, many of the parents are coming newly to the United States. So the students will be first-generation Americans. And what sometimes this carries with it is certain baggage from back home, where people have been very much conditioned to take a quietist approach to politics. To say, keep your head down, focus on your studies, do not get involved in politics. And that's part of the reason why you don't find a lot of Muslim Americans outside of technical fields. Whereas you need journalists, you need lawyers, you need teachers which is sort of the soft power that the community is lacking. And it's a soft power that's accumulated over generations. When there's that comfort established, when you can breathe easy, you've arrived, you're here, you don't have to prove anything anymore, now you can speak out a little bit. So it's very important to see there are positive changes amongst the youth. And it's not just in the Islamic schools. But one of the issues that I do find at the Islamic school is because just about everybody's on the same page, there's very little depth to the understanding. And it sort of becomes like an echo chamber. Where do you really hone your skill of debating and coming really correctly with the facts is when you are trained in practicing with opposition. This happens to a lot of pro-Palestinian students at public schools, at private schools. And these kind of people don't have much of a problem then getting on Piers Morgan's show and being able to refute his very easy talking points. But unfortunately, at schools where it's the community is very much on the same page, that is a skill that's lacking. So just a couple of points, and I'll end with this before handing it back to Reverend Kiana. There are things that we need to do as educators about the subject of Palestine. The first is have students read. The students have to read. The movies and the visual stimulation that comes about from these clips can be very effective, but it does not necessarily equip the student with the kind of critical thinking skills they need to be able to contemplate and then be able to re-articulate what they've just read. This is very important. The second is to try to expose students to speakers who can speak from a first-hand experience, who can say, this is what I lived through. Leave aside the books, leave aside the movies, leave aside all those things, and just hear what I have to say. Now, you can like it or dislike it, but it's a fact of what I lived. That's something very important. And the third thing, and this is very important, is to teach our students excellence. Excellence in whatever they do. And that means that even if we sometimes get very passionate about our cause, and we think that so long as they understand that cause, we can give them the pat on the shoulder and say, well done, we really have to say, you need to be good at those other things too. You need to be good at reading, at writing, at speaking, at math, at science, because one day you might be in a position of power. And many, many people who are pro-Israel, they are not career pro-Israel advocates. They are professionals in their own right who happen to be pro-Israel. So as pro-Palestinian people, as people who care deeply about this cause, whatever field we're in, we have to be excellent at it. Thank you very much.